Today we're going to be working on a set of cutting boards made from spalted beech and black epoxy. These make great gifts as well as products that you can sell. And make sure to stick around until the end to find out how you can win one of these cutting boards. I picked up this piece of beech from a local hardwood dealer. It cost around $45 and I'll be able to get 3 cutting boards out of it. If you'd like to see what happened to the curly maple board you see here, check out the link in the description to see that short video. Using a template I made, I traced out the shape of each board and then cut them out using a jigsaw. If you have access to a bandsaw, use that instead, but if not, a jigsaw works just fine. Just be aware that the thin blade will try to wander, meaning that if you're cutting right on the line on the top of your board, you may be going over on the bottom. To avoid this, go slow and try not to make sharp turns. Whichever cutting tool you choose to use, try to cut as close to the line as possible to make the coming steps easier and avoid tear out. My lines are pretty sloppy, and I definitely should have gotten a little closer to the line, but I was worried about going over, and in the end it all worked out fine. After all my pieces are rough cut, I grab my router and router table. A router is required for this job, but the table is not. Using a handheld router with a fixed base or plunging base will work just fine. My template had some residue on it from prior use, and I was afraid that it would keep the tape from adhering well. So for this and another reason that we'll talk about later, I decided to laminate my template with tuck tape. Use double-sided tape to attach your template to your board. I'm using a 3/8 inch high by 3/4 inch router bit with a top-mounted bearing, which when using the router table is below the cutters. And I set my router speed to its highest settings. I set the bearing's height so that it matches the template and slowly push the workpiece into the bit. Just like with a table saw, the router will dictate how quickly to move. Don't force the piece through, this will cause tear out or even kickback. Take your time, keep your hands away from the bit, and keep your template on the bearing, and this process should be easy and fun. After you have a first pass around the entire board, remove the template and start the process over using your first pass as your new template. Continue this process, making your way up the workpiece by raising the router's bit, but stop before you reach the top. I usually leave about a 1/2 inch unrouted at this point. To save time, if you're making multiple boards, repeat this process to all of them now before changing bits. Once complete, switch over to a flush trim bit with a bottom mounted bearing, which for us on the router table will appear on the top of the cutters. You might be asking why not just use this bit to start with, and that would be a fine option. It's exactly what we did on the maple cutting boards that were 3/4 inch thick. But these boards are around 1.25 inches thick, and the cutters on this bit are only 1 inch. So we used the templating bit to get down to a manageable size and cleaned up with this bit. The process of using this flush cutting bit is the same as the last bit we used. Just make sure to have the templated section of your board now facing up towards you. We haven't talked about it much yet, but as you may have noticed, some of the sections of these boards have some pretty significant tear out. Here's one example of that. I'm skipping this area for now, and I'll come back to it later and clean it up. These sections are caused in part because the wood is spalted. Spalting occurs as the wood decays, usually before the tree is cut down, and it gives the boards these awesome looking black streaks and patches. But it can also weaken parts of the board and cause cracking. We're going to be using these torn out areas to our advantage to make these cutting boards look even better. But first we need to clean up the areas that we skipped. I reattached my template and use it as a reference to clean up these areas. Once all the boards are routed, I move on to filling the voids with epoxy. I've never used epoxy in this capacity before, but I was excited to give it a shot. I started by using more tuck tape, which is a type of construction sheathing tape, to cover any cracks on one side of each board so that the epoxy won't leak out. Next, I used more tape to make a dam around the areas with voids. One of my boards was in pretty rough shape, and I didn't have a point on top or on bottom that matched my template. This meant that I couldn't attach tape and pour. To solve this, I reattached my template and used it as a guide to tape to. This was the other reason I chose to laminate my template. Now, when the epoxy hardens to it, I should be able to pull off the template and reuse it. I'm using Total Boat epoxy for this project, and their pumps and instructions made the process super easy. Once I was sure I had the right pump on the right bottle, I added an equal amount of pumps from each bottle. I then added some black pigment and mixed the two parts together for about 2 minutes. With my epoxy mixed, I lined up the boards and began to pour. After some more research, I believe that I should have added the step of sealing the surface of these boards with clear epoxy before pouring. Sometimes the pigment and the dye can stain the boards, but luckily I didn't have any issues with staining here. But keep that in mind if you're going to do your own. Once poured, I used a blow dryer with the heat set to high to pop any air bubbles in the epoxy. This worked fine, but the force of the air did move the epoxy around a bit, and for this reason, a torch may be a better option in the future. After waiting 24 hours, I pulled off my tape and template. It took some time to get the template off, but when it eventually did, it came off clean and in one piece like I had hoped, so I'll be able to continue to use this going forward. The bottom side of one board had another void. I flipped it over and filled it like I had done the rest. I also had some small cracks that I could have filled with more epoxy, but I wanted to try out another method. I picked up some black CA glue and used it to fill these cracks. Then would spray activator on it to speed up the drying process. Using the epoxy went great, and even though I made a few small mistakes, I'm really happy with the end result. And the same thing is true with this CA glue. The upside to the glue is that it dries faster than the epoxy, and the downside is that you can't fill a large gap with it. If you have to pick one, go with the epoxy, but it's nice to have both on hand, as the glue is great for last-minute touch-ups. After my glue and epoxy were dry, I went back to the router table and cleaned up my edges a bit. I switched between the flush trim bit and the templating bit, and sometimes I'd use my old template as a guide. To be totally honest, from the point I started to pour epoxy, I was convinced that I had ruined this project. I had a picture in my head, and the lumpy mess of the dry epoxy on wood was just not it. But after this process and seeing the clean, crisp lines between the black epoxy and the beech, I felt confident that I was on the right track. Next came my first stage of sanding. My goal here wasn't to finish sand, but to get both sides nice and flat. A wide belt sander or planer would have been a better option here, but you can usually work with what you have, and what I had was a palm sander. The downside to trying to flatten a board with a palm sander is that it's hard to flatten evenly and not cause divots or slopes. My best advice here would be to hold your sander as flatly as possible, not on an edge. This will be slower, but it will give you a better finished product. I started with 80 grit and then went to 100, 120, and finally 150. I did this to both sides of the boards until they were flat. Then, because I'm impatient, I sprayed a little water on them and lightly sanded again to try to get a glimpse of what they'd look like when they were done. Once my boards were flat, I went back to the router table and set up a 3/8 inch roundover bit. This takes the hard edges off the board and makes it better to handle and to look at. The 3/8 inch is my go-to roundover bit for 3/4 inch cutting boards. But with these boards being thicker, I thought I'd try a more aggressive roundover. I picked up this 5/8 inch bit and ran one of my boards through it. I really wasn't sure which would look better here, and that's a lot of what woodworking is. Having an idea, loving it, sleeping on it, then hating it, trying to work up the confidence to try it, second guessing yourself again, and then hopefully finally trying it, and whatever the results may be, pretending that you like it better that way. Sorry for the image quality here, and epoxy shaving caught perfectly on the edge. I looked at both boards side by side, and honestly I like them both. I think I prefer the larger roundover visually, but these are cutting boards, and scraping food off the board with the larger rounded edges may be a pain. I'm keeping this one as is because I like it, and because there's no way to go back. But I'll keep the other two boards with the smaller roundover. If you prefer one of these profiles to the other, let me know in the comments. Next, I used my template to line up the center hole in the handle and drilled it using a 1-inch Forstner bit. Then rounded over the edge of this like we did the rest of the boards. I then move on to the sanding process, working my way up from 120 grit all the way to 320 using my sander, then hand sanding the epoxy sections all the way up to 1500 grit, then finally buffing them with a quadruple O Scotch-Brite pad. This process is pretty simple, so while I work on it, let's talk about how you can win one of these boards. We've got big plans for the future here at One Way to Make. Soon we'll be moving into a new workshop. We have some big new projects that we'll be talking about shortly. And as of today, we're launching our website, onewaytomake.com. Our first products, these cutting boards and the curly maple versions of them, are available now. To celebrate the launch, we'll be giving away one of each of these cutting boards to one of our YouTube viewers. To enter, all you need to do is leave a comment in this video and make sure that it contains either the word beech, if you want this cutting board, or maple, if you want the curly maple cutting board. We'll be picking one winner for each cutting board. And as an added bonus, because we're really trying to grow this channel, if this video gets 10,000 views, we'll be giving away one more of each of these cutting boards. So get subscribed, hit the like button, share the video with friends, and most importantly, leave a comment that includes the words beech or maple to get entered. Good luck! If you don't happen to win and would still like one of these cutting boards or to help us out, they're available to buy at onewaytomake.com. We finished these boards with pure tung oil and added a splash of citrus solvent to thin the oil out and make the wood absorb it more easily. We bought both the solvent and the oil from the Real Milk Paint Co., and they worked fantastic. Tung oil is definitely going to be my go-to food-safe finish from now on. I'm so happy with how these cutting boards came out, but my favorite thing about them is that they really are easy to make. If you can get access to a router, sander, and something to cut out the rough shapes with, I think someone could batch out enough of these in a weekend to get all their gifts accounted for the whole year, or start selling these online or at craft fairs. If you are that person, good luck and let me know how it goes. Stay tuned for lots more coming soon. Good luck in the contest, and thanks for watching.